All right. Well, today we are in the third part of a series called Summer Love. We're talking about romantic relationships, and today's the end of the series. So if you're tired of hearing about relationships, this is the last week you got to listen to it. But basically what we've been doing is looking at some great movies, but some not so great lessons that often come from these movies. And sometimes, if you're like me, you get so caught up in the story that maybe it's not so obvious that there's something going on there that we might not want to reproduce in our own lives. So I'll tell you a little story. My wife, Allie, and I, before we were married, we went to this movie, and we were talking about getting engaged, but it hadn't happened yet, and so it was just like in the near future. And we go to the movie, and it's a love story, right? She gets to pick the movie, so there's this girl who's getting ready to be engaged to this guy, and he goes away, and she decides she's going to surprise him and go after him. In some foreign country, she's going to go get him, and they're going to get married, and it's going to be great. Well, she gets there, and she meets this cab driver, and right away, you know, there's that tension, like they're fighting, but it's cute fighting, right? And they're going back and forth, and before you know it, they fall in love, and she marries him. And it's great. And so we're leaving the movie, and I look over, and Allie's like, oh, just excited again, because it was a nice little warm love story. And I was like, yeah, I don't know if I'd like it if I was that first guy. Right? And it was easy for me to connect with that guy because we were in that position. We were getting ready to be engaged. And she's like, well, I guess maybe just because I'm a grump and I'm like ruining all the fun. She's like, yeah, I guess I didn't think about it that way. But we get so caught up in the main character, the main story, that we don't think about, okay, what else is actually going on in this story? There could be little things, like I mentioned Aladdin, where he asked Jasmine to jump off a building with him 5 minutes after they meet. He's like, do you trust me? And she does. That's crazy. It could be something smaller, like kissing a woman while she's sleeping, right? That's not something you want to reproduce in real life. There are little things, but then there are also some really big things. And these are the things we spent some time on. We looked at the movie Cinderella, which has a theme that we've seen over and over and over again. We called it the glass slipper. And the glass slipper is this idea that you complete me, that you're my other half, that there's someone out there that will be the right to my left. And that's great for a plot in a movie. It builds a lot of anticipation, but in real life, it creates a lot of serious problems. One, it totally removes the value of being single, which is a really valuable thing. And two, if you're out there looking for your other half, then the implication is that you're not whole. And ultimately, we end up looking for a person to help us discover who we really are, or to make us whole, to complete us. The relationship, we could say, becomes the solution to the problem. And you see this in movie after movie, right? Cinderella becomes who she was made to be after she meets the prince. How many movies follow that same line, that same storyline? Once they met, well, now they are who they were supposed to be and everything is right. Makes for a good story, but it's not a great principle to carry into relationships. Eventually, you end up asking for a person or relationship, we believe, to do really what only God can do for you. It puts too much pressure on the relationship and takes the value away from being single. Then the next week, we talked about Beauty and the Beast, which is an entertaining movie. They remade it, and it was entertaining as well, but there's all sorts of issues with that movie. I mean, there's a woman being held in a castle against her will. There's this angry beast, and somehow they fall in love. We said that the rose in that story, if you know the story, it's the hope that he'll change. That beneath the beast, there's a prince. And the problem with that is when we take that into our own relationships, it also creates some serious problems. I mean, we're a church. We believe in change. We celebrate change. We look for change. We cultivate change. We encourage change. But in a relationship, you shouldn't bank, especially a dating relationship, you shouldn't bank on change. Sometimes we'll allow chemistry to compensate for real issues of character because we're banking on the idea that he'll change or she'll change. And then what eventually happens is we bring that thinking into the relationship after marriage, and it creates a posture, not of he'll change, but why does he need to change? Because, well, he's the problem. And of course, this works the other way around, the hope that she'll change, which eventually turns into she's the problem. And then the relationship is nothing more than pointing out the flaws in one another because I was banking on you becoming something else. And I didn't say this exactly like this last week during the message, but really the question you should ask yourself if you're dating, if you're getting ready to be with someone, getting ready to marry someone, is if they did not change at all forever, would I still want to be with them? Or are you banking on this hope that he'll change? It creates all sorts of issues. And so this week, we are talking about another movie. It's actually not just one movie. And last week and the week before, to introduce you to the stories, we did some trivia. So this week, we'll do a little trivia to introduce you to the stories that we're talking about. Though I'll warn you, this week it's a little easier, okay? Here's the first question. What happens in the final scene of Aladdin? Anybody know? The very last scene. Yes? They get married. Bingo. A wedding. How about this? What happens in the final scene of 101 Dalmatians? Not your typical love story. Anybody know? Any guesses? There's not a wedding, a double wedding. The dogs and the people get married. Okay, here's another movie. What happens in the final scene of The Little Mermaid? Anyone want to guess? A wedding. Bingo. How about this? We'll do one more question. What happens in the final scene of Cinderella? A wedding. That's right. And often, I mean, I guess 101 Dalmatians is an exception to this, but often it's not just any wedding, it's a royal wedding. It's a prince and a princess, and guess what? Guess what? They lived, everybody. Happily ever after. That is good. That's good. They lived happily ever after. And so I didn't have one movie. It was kind of hard for me to figure out a prop for this week. And so we had the glass slipper, we got the rose. We got another one this week. Let's bring it out here. It's a little bit more of a challenge. There it is. This is our cake that represents, careful with that, the royal wedding. Thank you. It's fake. You ever see that show on Netflix called Is It Cake? Yeah. It's on. Okay, anyway, the royal wedding, right? They lived happily ever after. If we were going to put this in English, we would say, and from that point on, they were happy. They were happy. And that makes like a really, really good way to set up a story, right? But the marriage comes at the end of the story. And so if you think about all of these, there's drama, there's heartbreak, there's miscommunication, misunderstanding, there's a villain that threatens to mess up the whole thing. There's all this, anxiety and uncertainty. Is Aladdin gonna tell her that he's not really a prince? Are we ever gonna find out about that? What about the genie, right? Cinderella's glass slipper. What if the sisters got the same size foot as her? And there's all this like, oh no, what's gonna happen? Up and down, up and down. But then the wedding and all the problems are solved. They live happily ever after. The problem with the royal wedding, what it teaches is that it's the end of the problems. When in reality, though this may seem kind of, grim, the wedding is the beginning of the real problems. And not just, toothpaste and underwear and snoring, but real problems, like serious hurt feelings, miscommunications. And if you go into a relationship thinking, well, we just got to get to the wedding, and then we'll have our happily ever after, and then from that point on, we'll be happy. Then when things go wrong, especially if you've bought into the Cinderella glass slipper idea, then you start questioning, maybe this wasn't the one, maybe I've made a mistake, maybe this isn't going to make me happy. When Allie and I first started talking about starting a church, it was like 2010. We weren't married at the time, and I had this little journal. I would write about it. I'd pray about it. We would talk about what it could look like to start a church for people that typically wouldn't show up in a regular church. And so for years, we were excited about this. We tell our friends. We try to convince people to help us do it. This whole big, long process. Then a few years, around 2017, 2018, we started really doing the training. We went away, went to Alabama. We had to go through counseling, coaching. It was a big, long process. We traveled around the country trying to get financial supports that we could open our doors. We looked for a location. We had plans of renting a few doors down. Then we lost that location before, 2 weeks before everything opened. We had to build a team, find people that were crazy enough to help us get started. I had to take Tom out to breakfast 96 times to convince him to come join us. And it was this whole big, long process. And I remember launch day, it was January 5th, 2020. It's like, wow, we're here. We made it. We had the service. It was amazing. And I remember feeling like, it's over. The process is over. We did it. But then I realized this isn't the end. This is day one, right? This is the beginning of the life of the church, not the end of a process. And that shift was so important for me to make mentally. And for some of us, the way that we understand relationships, it really should require us to make that shift. Okay, I'm committing to go into this relationship, but the wedding is the beginning. It's the start. And whatever problems we had along the way are gonna show up maybe in more serious ways that we'll need to work through. And the amazing thing is that this really for you, if you're in a relationship, I know I really sound like a downer at this point, but really they can be incredible opportunities for growth and intimacy. If you go into it knowing, all right, there's gonna be some problems we weren't expecting. And it's gonna require us to get to know each other better and to make some sacrifices. But if you go in expecting nothing, you're gonna have serious problems. The other issue with this whole idea of happily ever after, they lived happily ever after. Like I said, if we put this into just regular English, the languages, and they were happy from that point on, which then can create this expectation that the relationship is supposed to make me happy. I can't tell you how many relationships, how many people I've spoken to in relationships where that's ultimately what it came down to. I had this expectation that they were gonna make me happy and they didn't. And that phrase itself, if you break it down a little bit, the idea of something being it's supposed to make you happy, that's the language of expectation and entitlement. And where there's expectation, you eliminate the ability to have genuine gratitude. Because if you meet an expectation, you're just doing what you're supposed to do. And when there's no gratitude, you're eroding at the ability to experience joy in a relationship. We did a whole series about this. I'm not saying it's right or wrong to have expectations. I'm saying the more expectations you have going into a relationship, the more you're undermining your ability to actually experience genuine gratitude and joy in that relationship. And it all comes back to this belief that this is supposed to make me happy. And when they don't follow through with what I expected them to do, there's now a debtor relationship. Like, you were supposed to do this. You were supposed to make me happy. This was what you were supposed to do in this relationship. And now you owe me. And we may not say it, but there's a feeling that we're owed something. And if you're wondering, if you're in a relationship and you're wondering, has expectation really taken root in this relationship? The question to ask is, when you don't get what you want, does it feel unfortunate or unjust? Is it simply an unmet, an unfulfilled desire? Or is it an unmet expectation? So it creates all sorts of issues because we end up believing that it's supposed to make us happy. And so what are we supposed to do then if you're in a relationship? Well, the Apostle Paul wrote a letter to a church in Ephesus, and it's super practical. He starts out very theological, but then he goes into the practical side of things. He even gives specific instructions to specific parties in a typical household in that culture. This was a normal way of writing in the ancient world. It's called a household code. And he starts off this household code with this topic sentence, with this one idea. And this idea, though it may seem counterintuitive, ends up being one of those things that when you do it, feelings follow. The feelings of joy and satisfaction that we're looking for end up following, but we have to be willing to do this. And so here's what he says to start out this whole thing. He says, ready? This is the topic sentence for husbands, wives, anybody in the household. He says, here it is, ready? He says, submit to one another. That's the way to genuine love. Now, that's not very sexy or exciting. You're not going to see that in any 25th anniversary. I've loved submitting to you for the past 25 years. However, it's an amazing thing. If you think about it. If you're familiar with this passage, you might be thinking, okay, that's where we're going with this, right? Or maybe you've kind of heard this before, but just pretend you haven't. This is not a normal way to write, right? Typically, it would be submit to some figure of authority, right? Submit to your leader, submit to your boss, submit to the king, submit. But he says submit to one another. It's the idea of mutual submission. The word has the idea of putting the other one, the needs, the desires of the other before yours. Or simply for the sake of today, and this is not a bulletproof definition, but a memorable way you can think of this is simply saying, I'll go first. We've been going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, and somebody's got to apologize, I'll go first. We haven't been on the same page, and somebody's got to be the one to initiate a discussion here, to be the one to put in some effort. I'll go first. Someone's got to be the one to break this cycle of constant cutting down, of undermining one another. We've talked about it. We've said we're going to do it, but you know what? I'll go first. It's being willing to do the hard thing first, to love first, to put the other first. And the amazing thing about submission is mutual submission is not mutual compromise. It's not 50-50. It's all right, you give me a little, I'll give you a little, and we'll meet in the middle, and neither one of us will be really all that happy, but at least we're both equally all that not happy, right? It's mutual submission. It's 100. It's an amazing thing if you just try to imagine that for a minute. And this is what he's saying. It's hard, it's dangerous, it's vulnerable. But saying, I'll go first, this is the kind of choice that the feelings follow. So maybe you're sitting here today, maybe you're in a relationship, and you're like, yeah, okay, it sounds nice, but my relationship's complicated. We've got these issues from the past that are kind of whatever, and in theory, if we were just starting out, maybe, but this same guy, Paul, wrote a letter to another church where he talks about love. And in that church, He's writing not just to two people in a relationship, he's writing to a huge group of people. And they've gotten all caught up in the sparkly, shiny aspects of church and spirituality and religion. And he tries to wind them down and bring them back to the basics. And he talks about love, this idea of loving first, which is part of submission. And I think for us today, especially if you're feeling like your relationship is a little complex, like you don't know where to start, he might say forget about all the shiny aspects of the relationship, all the things that we celebrate and see on TV and read about in books, and just reel it in a little bit. Let's get back down to the basics with love. And he kind of gives this list, which seems a little bit like a ramble, and you've probably heard it if you've been to a wedding before. He's actually not talking about romantic relationships, but it's the same idea. He's telling the church to get back to basics. And I think for us, he might say the same thing. And here's what he says. You ready? He says, love is patient. Patient. Now, if you've heard that, you're like, oh yeah, and you might be even going to the next one, when are we gonna get to kind, right? But if you just think about that, when do you need to be patient? This is the language of living in a problem. You need to be patient when you don't wanna be patient, right? When you gotta wait for them to get ready, when you gotta wait for them to come home. Patience is saying okay, we'll go your pace instead of my pace. We'll travel at your speed instead of mine. That's inconvenient and it's unnatural. But this is what love is. This is, I'll go first. He says it's kind. Now, kind, you might think kind and think soft and smiley, but kind is really this idea of loaning your strength to another. Saying, okay, what that I have the ability to do can be used for you. I'll go first. It's patient, it's kind, and then he kind of bunches a few little negatives in here, but it's because they're all similar. He says, it does not envy, it does not boast, it is not proud. And now maybe you're thinking about a relationship you're in, and you're like, all right, I don't think we envy each other, we don't brag, it's not a pride thing. But really, this is the language of isolation. It's the language of insecurity and isolation, actually drives a wedge in between. Now, I've never looked at my wife and thought oh, I really want, the furniture or the clothes that you have. But you know what I have done? I have said, do you know what I've been doing? I've done this and this and this and this, and how about you? Right? Have you ever been there? Where it's how come I'm not getting the same thing you're getting? I want the treatment that you have. And this comes in all shapes and forms. And we're actually dividing, pleading each other, my own case, and she pleads hers. But it doesn't bring the two together, it draws a wedge. He says, it doesn't dishonor. It's not self-seeking, and it's not easily angered. This word dishonor, lately I've been fascinated with that word. Think about this, okay? The word dishonor, it doesn't mean disrespect. To dishonor something is to treat it as common. And so I don't know if I would say I dishonor my wife, but I'm definitely guilty of just treating her like everyone else. Common. Paul would say love treats people like they have unique value, especially in the context of relationship. You're different to me. You have a different place, and you deserve different treatment. It's not self-seeking. It's not saying you go first. It's saying I'll go first. It's not easily angered. This is the idea of being stirred up, having your buttons pushed. It keeps no record of wrongs. I like this because I don't need to explain it. We can just sit there for a second. There's no list. The fingers don't come out and get stretched individually. I mean, really, just think about it. What a gift, if you're in a relationship, what a gift it would be to the person that you're with if you just forgot everything wrong they've done. That record was just gone. Think about the weight that would take off of them. Because it's not easy. It doesn't delight in evil, but it rejoices with the truth. This word for truth here, it really what he's doing is contrasting two ideas. This is a fancy poetic way to say the word for truth has this idea of uprightness. He's saying it looks for the good. It's not sitting there nitpicking. It's giving the benefit of the doubt, looking to see and celebrate the good in the other, even when you don't want to. And then he gives another list of a few alwayses. He says it always protects, it always trusts, it always hopes, it always perseveres. We actually talked for an entire week just about this verse here, especially this idea of always trusting. This is the idea of what do you do when there's a gap in knowledge? When he's not home, but you don't know why? What's the story that you write? What does your first draft sound like? When you see a text message he or she sent to someone else, what were the motives behind it? Are they trusting or are they immediately assuming the worst? How do you fill the gaps? This is what love does. And it's hard. This is the language. All of this is not the language of happily ever after. This is the language of heads up, it's gonna be hard. And it's gonna be worth it. It's gonna be great. But if you're going into a relationship expecting it to be all sunshine and rainbows very quickly, especially if you've bought into the glass slipper, you're gonna be questioning the decision that you've made. Because it's gonna be hard. And these problems can be either things that divide us or actually opportunities to grow closer together if we're willing to say, I'll go first. This passage where Paul says submit to one another, it doesn't finish there. It's actually just the first part. And if you're not a person of faith and you're totally not open to it, I understand that, but this is kind of as far as I can take you. Maybe all this has been helpful. But if you're open to the idea that Jesus is who he said he is and that he did what he said he would do, then I think this could be the game changer. He says, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Now think about that. If you've heard that and you're familiar with it, it just sounds normal. Okay, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Great, what's the next verse say? But it doesn't really make much sense. Right? Or it's not what would come naturally when you're writing submission. Normally it'd be like submit to one another out of love for one another. Submit to him out of respect for him. Submit to her out of your affection for her. But he brings in a third party here. Now, when you hear reverence, if you're like me, maybe you think of places with like high ceilings that echo with candles on the side, and you're like, okay, yes, God, I'll do that because it makes you happy. But the idea is not simply like fear, it's a response to what Jesus has done for us. He's saying, you treat one another a certain way because of how Jesus has treated you. You see, Paul's writing to people, and he's already explained this in his letter, but he's explained just how far God has gone for us. How we, at our absolute worst, when we don't trust him, don't believe in him, don't want anything to do with him, don't have time for him, like are annoyed by the people that do, when we keep him as far away as we possibly can, the Apostle Paul would explain, like, it's at that moment when you're right there, when you feel like, okay, right about now I think I'm at my worst. That's when Jesus would give everything for you, out of his love for you. And when that takes root within us, that he gave us what we do not deserve, it gives us something to draw from. And so what this looks like practically is like, I don't go first because you did last time. I don't go first because you deserve it. I don't go first because I love you. Because sometimes you won't feel like it. You go first because he went first for you. When you are not worth forgiving, or being pursued. He forgave and pursued you. And he's saying, like, do that out of your love for me. He introduces a source. We talked about this a few weeks ago. Like a spring of living water, he called it in another passage. A source that does not run out. And I'll tell you, there are times where probably Allie does it more than I do. But where the way she treats me, like the motivation is not anything I've done. And if you've done this, you know this. It's like, I don't have anything to give you. Like, you have not earned my affection. I'd like to say I'm doing this because I love you, but right now I'm spent. And if you can take a moment to get your head in the right place and really think about how far God has gone for you. This is not an easy thing. It takes work. But if you, like, maybe you get away and you download, like the song we were singing, Reckless Love. And just stop and think about even just a few minutes ago, I'm thinking about some of the lines in this song, and I'm like, they're really crazy. Like, when I was your foe, still your love fought for me. It chases me down. Like, you stop and you think about that. And he's not just saying I go first, but I will go out of my way and give all I have to win your affection. Now, like, draw from that, and even though he doesn't deserve it, forgive him. Even though you've done it before, do it again for her. We do it because God is love. John said at the end of his life, he had been with Jesus, he heard all Jesus' teachings about God, and he came to the conclusion that God was the embodiment of love. In other words, God is patient with you. He goes at your speed. He is kind. He draws near instead of division. He treats you like you're worth everything. And so draw from that. And those are the kind of choices that the feelings of happiness tend to follow. When we say, I'll go first, because Jesus said, I'll go first. I'm going to ask the band to come back up here. But here's the last picture I want to leave you with. And this is not a perfect parallel, but maybe it'll kind of help you understand exactly the idea that Paul's trying to communicate. So some of you know I have two kids. I have a boy and a girl, Mia and Logan. They're 7 and 9, and they're great, usually. But sometimes they fight with each other like brothers and sisters do. And so we'll tell them, okay, you guys got to get along. You got to get along. Logan, you got to get along with Mia. Mia, you got to get along with Logan. Back and forth, back and forth. And sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't. But recently we went away. We went to Chicago to meet with one of our partner churches. And we left them with Nana and Big Pops. And that's when I get concerned that they're going to start arguing with one another. And I've told my son, Logan, get along with Mia. And he'll reply and say, okay. But the last time, right before I left, I pulled him aside. And I said, hey, I'm not going to be here to take care of your sister. Will you take care of her for me? And he looked at me, and it just hit him in a different way. Rather than telling him to just get along with her because of their relationship, I introduced a third relationship and invited him to draw on the relationship he has with me and use that to say, with her, all right, I'll go first. We can watch Barbie instead of Sonic. But that's the idea here. So maybe for you, maybe you're in a relationship and you just have nothing left. Or maybe you'll be there soon. And when you don't want to forgive, when you don't want to wait, when you don't want to be kind, when you don't want to try, when you're tired of initiating or being the one who's going to communicate, maybe you need to hear Jesus stop and say, will you do that this time for me? Not because they deserve it, Not because she deserves it or he deserves it, but for me.